Let's take a look at some wrestling magazines from 1950s and early 1960s. These magazines are extremely rare. They're very brittle. If they weren't taken good care of, the paper would crumble in your hands. I've had some issues where I turn the page and it just almost turned into moths. These are hard to find in good shape. I've been very lucky. It took me, some years to complete the entire set. I went through some bad ones, but all in all, the ones that I have are in fairly good condition for this type of magazine, but the paper was so brittle. The very first wrestling magazine ever, strictly wrestling only, not a combo with boxing, was simply titled Wrestling. It came out in January 1951, and it ran for 7 issues. Some of the collectors thought there was 5, and some knew of a 6th issue. There's actually 7. We'll get to that when we get to it. So January 1951, simply just titled Wrestling. Issue number 2 in February. March 51. Now we're ahead of May 51. This artwork is pretty cool. It was all painted and hand drawings. They usually have the artist's signature at the bottom. Some of these do, some of them don't, but they're pretty cool. This is in June of 51. July. This is issue number 6 for the people who didn't know what number 6 looked like. And the very rare, hard to find, supposedly. I don't think it's that rare. I think people mistake it sometimes for a boxing combo magazine when it's not. It's strictly a wrestling magazine, and it is number 7. It came out in September. And that is it for that run of Wrestling magazine. Following in its heels, right behind it, was Official Wrestling, and they started also in 1951. But their issue started in April. So April 1951 was Official Wrestling at the title. This name is going to change several times. They're all connected. They're all the same format, same people, but just a slightly different with some of the style and some of the name changes. And I'll point that out to you as we go. So April 51, Official Wrestling. May 51. June, August, September, and now we're in a 52. This is February 1952, and look at the first change already. NWA is added to the official. So it's NWA Official Wrestling, February 1952. Go to March 52. April 52, May, June, skipping ahead, it's August, September, October, November, December. First cover with the world champion on the cover with his belt, Luthez. Now we're in January 1953, February, March, April, May, June, Mildred Burke, female world champion on the cover. There's no July, it goes to August. And that was it. August, that came up quick. August of 53 will be the final issue. Also, another title change. It is now called Wrestling World. Some people say it was World Wrestling. It's Wrestling World. It says it inside, Wrestling World. So the very first Wrestling World issue, February 1954. April 1954, May, July, August, September, October, November, December 1954, January 1955. Coming towards the end now, I think there's only a couple issues left, and the magazine started to get really cheap. The cover is the same paper as the inside of the magazine, very newspaper, cheap, flimsy. There's no sheen or gloss to it. There's no nice texture to the paper whatsoever. It's very brittle. These last couple issues are very difficult to find because they did not hold up. They were very brittle and very hard to maintain. So the last couple in 55, if you can find them, be on the lookout of some bad quality of them, because they were very, very flimsy and brittle. So January 55, I think this might be the last one, yes. May of 55 is the last issue, and you can see that the cover has just kind of lost its luster and it's just changed. And that would be the end of the run of Wrestling World in 55. And moving up to 1956, I usually don't show combo magazines. Most of them were boxing dominant. This Ringside, which would later be called Real Ringside, was only around for a handful of issues, and it was wrestling first and boxing, so it was a little more wrestling dominant, basically 50-50, but wrestling was more of the feature. And these are pretty hard to find. If you can find these, the whole collection, I mean you can find one or two here and there, but to be able to complete it, it took a little while. But this was January of 1956, boxing and wrestling, Ringside. The second issue was March 56, and then they changed the name again to Real Ringside, Wrestling and Boxing. And this was May of 56, July of 56, September 56, November 56, and they released, I've never seen another one. I would love to hear in the comments if anyone has one. I'm yet to see another one. The same company, Real Ringside, put out girl wrestlers from all girl wrestling matches throughout the country, and it came out also in 56, and the entire magazine is dedicated to female wrestling. It's a good magazine, one of my favorites. I never realized how hard it was to find when a few people asked me about it and try to track one down for them. I've never ever seen another one, and this basically fell onto my lap. Wasn't even in search of it, didn't even know about it, and it just wound up in my hands one day. But pretty hard to find from what I'm told and from what I looked. If anyone else has one, I'd like to hear about it if you do. So that was it for 1956. 57, these are just some Japanese issue. Baseball magazine in Japan released two wrestling magazines in 1957. It was covering Ricky Dozan defending his title against Luthez, against his title versus title, to establish the NWA world title in Japan. And Ricky Dozan would take the title from Luthez, and that would establish Japan Pro Wrestling, which led on to New Japan and All Japan of today. So this was a pretty cool, extremely rare Japanese issue. I have hundreds of Japanese issues. They're by far my favorite. We'll get into that on a Japanese video one day, but I just thought I'd show these because it was in the 50s time frame. 1957, I believe this was April of 1957, and this is the second issue. Just have to look. November of 57 it came out. Like I said, this is a baseball magazine, and the baseball magazine just released two special wrestling boxing magazines for this event, but it's not boxing related. It's strictly wrestling, and it's mostly Luthez and Ricky Dozan's coverage. So those were two very, very difficult magazines to find in 1957. In 1959, this was the very first wrestling review. We're back in the hands of Stanley Weston. Stanley Weston had something to do with the wrestling in 1951. He did some artwork for them, and he would go on to later on sell those through his London publishing company in the back issues of the magazines for a short time. So Stanley Weston put out the very first wrestling review. This is a pretty sought-after collectible in fall of 1959. When Wrestling Review sold to Lou Eskin, Stanley Weston put out Wrestling Illustrated. This came out in January of 1965. They say it's the precursor to Pro Wrestling Illustrated. It was just a great magazine. They had some color pinups in it, some great coverage. I really like these Wrestling Illustrateds a lot. I wish it would have stayed, but it would eventually become The Wrestler. So the first issue, January 1965, February 1965, March, and we go ahead to May. It's Buddy Rogers, first bloody cover. June, the match that they wanted but never happened. I actually have two of these. One of them signed by Bruno. Okay. September 65, and that was a wrap. It would eventually hybrid with the Girl Wrestling. Girl Wrestling put out, I think, 3 issues by themselves. Let's see, spring of 65, it was just all female wrestling. Summer 65, and winter 65. Yes, they put out 3 solo girl wrestling magazines, and then they merged them with the Wrestling Illustrated. So we have Wrestling Illustrated combined with Girl Wrestling. First issue was November 65. Didn't really care for these. It looked like an old tabloid, magazine from the newsstands, and I just didn't care for the look or the design of it. Next issue, January 66. April 66. This was a Canadian, mailed from Canada, a wrestling photo album. This is like an encyclopedia. The pictures inside almost look like an old high school yearbook. Has a very small square 1-inch by 1-inch photo of every wrestler who's in the wrestling business, all through the men, the women, the midgets, and it has all the title history up at this point. It was released in 1965. Very, very hard to find. It covers from 1900 to 1965, and it's a pretty collectible piece. You don't see these very often. It's a great source of information. It covers all the different territories, the different promoters from each territory, from each state, each champion at that time, and then the combining of the NWA. It's just a pretty cool overall wrestling album. And this was in 1967. It's a championship wrestling from Florida. It's got Eddie Graham and Sammy Steamboat on the cover when they were the tag team champions. And this is a pretty cool little magazine. It doesn't really have it's not a continuing run. I just threw it in there because it was from the 60s. But it's I've never seen another one myself. It's pretty rare, and it's pretty cool. And I really enjoyed this issue. I wish there was a lot more of them, to be honest with you. All right, so that covers the 50s through the early part of the 60s.